From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinion featured in JAMA.
I'm Dr. Gregory Curfman, the executive editor of JAMA, and in this JAMA author interview, I'll be speaking with Dr. Philip Bickler and Dr. Michael Lipnick. Dr. Bickler is the chief of neuroanesthesia and director of the Hypoxia Research Laboratory at UCSF, and Dr. Lipnick is associate professor of anesthesia at UCSF. As co-authors, they have written a JAMA Viewpoint article, which is titled Evidence Against Use of Nitrogen for the Death Penalty. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Bickler and Dr. Lipnick.
It's great to be with you.
So good to have you. Thank you. So, Dr. Bickler, let's begin with you. And I wonder if you could please tell our listeners to what extent nitrogen asphyxiation is actually being used for executions in the United States. And are there plans to extend its use?
Thank you, Dr. Curfman. And thank you to the Journal for allowing consideration of this very difficult topic. Alabama executed a prisoner by the name of Kenneth Smith in January of this year. This was the first time ever that nitrogen had been used in an execution in the United States, or anywhere for that matter that we are aware of. 3 other states have plans prepared to use this method. The states of Oklahoma and Mississippi, as well as Alabama, have statutes on the books. And the state of Kansas is actively considering a proposal to adopt nitrogen asphyxia. And from what we have heard from lawyers in the death penalty community, there are about 40 inmates that are scheduled to be executed by this method.
Thank you for that information. And Dr. Lipnick, I wonder if you could please tell us the procedure of how nitrogen is administered in the execution setting. I wonder if you could paint that picture for us so everyone has an idea of exactly how the procedure is done.
Thanks, Dr. Curfman. I should start by saying that I have not witnessed a nitrogen execution directly, nor been able to access the full protocols that have been used, only seen either heavily redacted documents, but as we understand it, the original protocol and proposal was drafted by a criminal justice professor, not a doctor, not a scientist. And most of what we know is really coming from eyewitness accounts of the recent execution in Alabama. So I'm happy to walk through that. Based on what we know, the inmate was made NPO in the morning to minimize the chances of aspiration. They were taken into an execution chamber in the evening. Their body, their arms were restrained on a gurney. And then they were fitted with a gas delivery mask, which, as it's described, appeared to be a full face mask from the forehead to the chin. Unclear what the brand or type that was. So it's hard to say technically what the exact setup was. And then presumably gas was bled into that mask, pure nitrogen, to displace all the oxygen. We don't really know much about variables like the mask seal, the rebreathing of that setup, how exactly nitrogen was administered, all of which could have significant impacts on how they experienced the process. We just don't know entirely.
Okay, thank you for that. And now, Dr. Bickler, in your Viewpoint article, you describe this first episode, or now the only episode, of nitrogen execution, and you describe what eyewitnesses reported as they observed the procedure. I wonder if you could go over that for our listeners and give the listeners kind of a sense of your impression, what the victim was experiencing.
By all accounts of a number of witnesses who had been present at previous executions using lethal injection or other methods, the execution of Kenneth Smith was horrific. They described in detail how he struggled, and his struggles continued for some period of time. According to the eyewitness accounts, the nitrogen system began being used around 7:57 p.m., and he struggled for a total of about almost 10 minutes before he became quiet. And witnesses described gasping, heaving, violent movements against the restraint straps, and convulsions that occurred during this period of time. We don't know anything about the victim's level of consciousness during this period of time. But based on eyewitness accounts from not one, but a number of people, including reporters, as I said, who have witnessed previous executions, and Mr. Smith's spiritual advisor, it was a horrific experience. And it was not just the semi-professional observers who were subject to this awful spectacle. It was the family members of this man who was killed by nitrogen asphyxiation. The account, I think, to anyone who with any level of humanity is very concerning. And when the White House and the United Nations caught wind of the details of this, they responded with condemnation. States using executions have sought methods that are swift and humane. And in Kenneth Smith's case, and we fear in others, that states have not found a method that is either humane or swift. The Attorney General in the state of Alabama said that the execution was successful and proved the method. And in our opinion, and in the opinion of others, I think the only thing that was proved that day is that nitrogen asphyxiation is a cruel way to carry out an execution.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Bickler. And Dr. Lipnick, back to you. In the Viewpoint article, you make the point, it's an important point, that it's not really possible to research the extent to which an execution victim may suffer during nitrogen execution. You can't really perform that execution in the laboratory. And based on your experience and your knowledge of hypoxia and the research that you have done, I wonder if you might predict if more of these nitrogen executions are done, would you anticipate a similar outcome to the first one, or what is your view on this?
Thanks for the question. It's true. It's not possible ethically to study this in the exact way that would need to be done. Some of the best evidence historically probably can be extrapolated from controlled laboratory studies of acutely exposing humans to low oxygen concentrations. If you're wondering why any laboratory would want to take healthy humans and make them acutely hypoxemic, there are several reasons and a lot of literature on this. Some of the studies are conducted to just fundamentally better understand human physiology, how breathing is controlled, for example. Another reason would be more practical to see how our bodies react to low oxygen levels, like at high altitude, or, for example, how a pilot might react to a sudden loss of cabin pressure, sudden loss of oxygen. And then lastly, these types of controlled hypoxia studies in a laboratory are frequently used to validate the performance of medical devices like pulse oximeters. All pulse oximeters that make it to market require validation in humans during controlled hypoxemia. The experiments are done safely by applying a mask or a mouthpiece, slowly lowering the oxygen concentration by raising the nitrogen fraction, but only to safe levels, only for brief periods of time, but that's probably the best data set. It's important to note the healthy participants for these studies, they're monitored, it's a hospital setting, there's constant feedback to make sure they're comfortable, and our lab's been doing these studies for decades. To get back to your question, here's a little bit of what we know from doing these studies and thousands of volunteers over the last 30 years. The human response to hypoxemia is incredibly variable. This is true especially in the upper ranges of hypoxemia, and I would consider the upper ranges 70 to 100% saturation as measured by a pulse oximeter, for example. Those are still pretty low oxygen levels, but some people are relatively asymptomatic, whereas others have symptoms ranging from just mild shortness of breath and visual changes to full-blown feelings of suffocation, anxiety. But in lower levels, below 50% saturation, the kind of cruel nature of administering nitrogen to humans is much more universally apparent. We base this on observations and evidence before the mid-90s when research stopped using desaturations at these lower levels. Phil can probably speak to that better than I. He was a test subject prior to the 90s when he was working in the lab, so he can speak firsthand to some of these effects, but they are well described. When oxygen supply is abruptly cut off, humans will feel significant and distressing shortness of breath in many cases, usually accompanied by anxiety, increased heart rate, sweating, feeling kind of sleepy, visual loss, even a sense of impending doom as they go in and out of consciousness as the levels continue to drop. Sometimes this can be accompanied by like myoclonic jerking, even full-blown seizures. But the duration of these symptoms and the extent to which they're felt in the period until consciousness is lost, it's variable, but it does happen in many people. So at this point, the best prediction of whether or not people are likely to suffer during nitrogen asphyxiation as a method for execution probably comes from the observations that happened during the recent execution in Alabama. It seemed pretty clear that this was not a peaceful or quick process. And that is consistent with what we predict based on lots of data from controlled hypoxia studies.
Thank you very much for that. And finally, Dr. Bickler, I'd like to turn to a policy type question. If you're in a position to advise the officials who are in charge of executions in the United States, and you're asked to advise them on the use of nitrogen execution, what would you tell them?
I would tell them to abandon that approach. There's abundant medical evidence against it, and the eyewitness accounts of Kenneth Smith's execution are exceptionally clear and powerful. I think that it's important to recognize that nitrogen is not an anesthetic, and its effects would not be swift or humane in just about any imaginable case where nitrogen is forced upon an individual. Dr. Lipnick and I have been very careful in our discussions and what we've written on this topic to not take a position on the death penalty. Our message is simply that nitrogen is not an acceptable method. And I would remind officials that the method is not even advised for animals. The American Veterinary Medical Association has condemned it for the use of euthanasia in animals such as dogs. Our Animal Review Board that sanctions animal research prohibits it for killing rats and mice. I think that politicians have ample evidence to abandon this approach, and we certainly hope they do.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bickler and Dr. Lipnick. Your discussion has been very insightful about the implications of this very important issue regarding the use of nitrogen asphyxiation for executions. Clearly going to be a focus for discussion moving forward. So thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you, Dr. Curfman.
Thank you.
This JAMA author interview was produced by Daniel Musizi. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com. I'm Dr. Gregory Curfman, and thanks for listening.